Please start.
Okay.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for Alexander, who's in Brazil at the moment. And for those of you who are on the other side, good evening to Martin and others who are connected from Asia. So we're very glad to have you here for this other seminar of the International Seminar Series of GEPISA. We have today Alexandre Gomes that is presenting a project conducted with the Jacobs University in Bremen, Germany, on industrial policy and the creation of the electric vehicle markets in China, achievements and obstacles. We're very glad that Alexander has agreed to present his project here for several reasons. Not only in GEPISA, we are, as you all know, we are very interested both in all studies related to the electrification process, but also in the Chinese case. And we're very happy to include this project within our series because Alexander adopts a very peculiar perspective. Sorry, but people are coming in. We are interested in hearing about this project that is focused on a case study that adopts a disciplinary perspective that is also, I mean, very interesting from our own point of view, that draws into heterodox literature in industrial policy and political economy. So this is of interest for us, for me in particular, because I come from a similar disciplinary background. We are interested in this project also because Alexander can draw, and his colleagues can draw on a direct account of documents and interviews in Chinese. So it's also based on direct fieldwork in China. And so we will listen to a project that explains, looks critically at the picture behind China's success in terms of promoting electrification, looking at the intersection between two kinds of policies. So policies aimed at stimulating the demand in electric vehicles and policies directed at supporting infrastructure development. So Alexander will talk about this, analyzing policies, but also looking at the impact of these processes from an interesting view, because he also looks at the local dimension. So at the differences, at the geographical differences that are created by these policies. So we look forward to listening to your presentation, Alexander. You have about 45 minutes. Your presentation will be followed by a short discussion by Tommaso Hardy, our GEPISA director, and then we open to the floor. Overall, we have about 2 hours, so we generally have a rich debate. As you can see, people are entering the seminar. The seminar is also being recorded, so you will be available on our website in the following week, in the coming weeks. So please, Alexander, I leave the floor to you. You can share your screen, and I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorenza, for the introduction. And let me try to share my screen first. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, no need a presentation mode yet, but yeah, we can see your screen. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so thank you, Lorenza, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening for those in Asia. And I'd like to thank you first to Lorenza and of course also Tommaso and Martin for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you for the opportunity to present part of my research as well. So I'm very excited to present it and looking forward for comments, feedback, and criticisms. Okay. So I try to make it into 4 to 5 minutes, but if I happen to exceed, please let me know, then I can speed up by then. Okay. So just a second, I think there's someone with the mic open. If maybe there's... No? Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, who we can hear, but please mute yourself if you have an open mic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the presentation today is about the Chinese industrial policy for electric vehicles. And what I present today is based on 2 publications. So the first one, it's a paper I wrote with Professor Tobias ten Brink and also Robert Pauls. This paper has been published recently, the Cambridge Journal of Economics. So it was a joint publication. Professor ten Brink is in Bremen. Robert Pauls is actually based in Suzhou, China. He's still there, working there. And the second publication is a book Professor Tobias ten Brink and I have written, and it's not published yet, but should be out soon, maybe in August or September, I hope. So it's a book that deals with innovation in China, and they have a case study between a comparison between electric vehicles and semiconductors. So what I present today is based on these 2 publications mostly. So I divided my presentation into 7 different parts. So first, just a brief introduction and a background of the second part will be the role of the central state, of the Chinese central state, in promoting electric vehicles. Third part, I will dwell into the main policies used by the Chinese state to promote this industry. The fourth part, I delve into state-business relations, the relations between the state and different private firms. And the final part, I delve into the role of the local states in the promotion of electric vehicles, and also this comparison between 2 different cities, that is Shenzhen and Suzhou in China. And the final part I will conclude. So let's start with a brief introduction. So why should we study electric vehicles in the first place? Why is that so important? There are many, of course, justifications, but I'd like to emphasize that first, it can be considered a particular case of the broader innovation-driven strategy that the Chinese leadership has been putting forward, especially since the early 2000s. So when China started to really take conscious steps towards promoting innovation and promoting domestic companies. So what they call indigenous innovation or domestic innovation or self-directed innovation, depending on the translation. So electric vehicles is a particular case of this broader paradigm, if you wish. So it helps us to shed light on what's going on with the Chinese political economy as well, and how innovative or not it is. Second justification is because electric vehicles, of course, present a sort of intersection between different topics. So it's not only important because of economic and innovation and rationales, but also environmental concerns. I do not have time to dwell into environmental issues here, but it's an important topic that intersects with the rest of the economic and rationale behind promoting electric vehicles. And I think most here know that the Chinese electric vehicles, or how they call in China the NEVs, so new energy vehicles, have grown quite fastly and actually has become the largest in the world in late 2010s. So that itself already justifies the study of the topic. But despite this quite rapid growth, the technological upgrading in the sector has been somehow mixed. So the growth of the market has been somehow based on the sales of vehicles of lower technological sophistication, so that deserves also further scrutiny. So just some data as a background. So here I have sales of electric private passenger cars in China in 2021, and as you can see, the market really grows by the end of the decade, and especially in 2019, 2021, and also 22. We don't have the data here, but the growth has been quite impressive last year. So these are data only for electric private passenger cars. Now, there are other segments of the electric vehicles, of course. You can talk about electric buses or electric vans and mini trucks. And I think sometimes these different segments are not really talked about too. So I think it's important to highlight these different segments. So if you take the middle figure, for instance, electric buses, you can see that China pretty much dominates the global market in terms of deployment of electric buses. I'll speak a bit more about it when I go to the comparison between these two different cities. But even if you see the first figure, that's about electric vans and trucks, or sometimes they call it in China logistics vehicles. So those mini trucks for delivery on the last mile, for instance. China is also performing quite well. So it's not only that China is performing well in the more well-known private passenger car segment, but also on different segments such as buses and vans and mini trucks. Having said that, I have to start to discuss how China managed to have such an important position in the global market, how China has managed to really create this new industry, this new market out of nothing. And here I'd like to start highlighting the role of the central state. I do not have time to dwell into the history and the specifics of each measure, but it's important to point out the role of the central state in providing a sort of long-term agenda, which I would say started still in the 90s, a very timid fashion, with only the development of prototypes and R&D in basic research. But with time, it started to become more serious about it, and they really provide a long-term view on economic development, which again is based not simply on the promotion of electric vehicles, but is based on a broader paradigm that is to promote innovation and domestic companies. Not only because of the technological advancements and technological justifications, but also because of environmental justifications as well. And this provision of a sort of long-term agenda has created the political support and coherence and consistency over time. And that's something very important and sometimes neglected. So many countries have in one way or another invested in electric vehicles, but sometimes the agenda is very inconsistent. So one government starts promoting, and then there's a change in political power, the government starts to prioritize something else. That's something we see in Europe sometimes we see in Latin America. And what I highlight here is that here have a kind of coherent support, especially from 2009 onwards. And this sort of support and this set of different policies and even coherence and consistent over time means that the state takes risks in first place and therefore attenuates the uncertainties that are inherent in the processes of technological transformation or industrial transformation. That is, the state is not simply, let's say, fixing the market, as the more mainstream literature will argue. We have market failures, and the state goes there to fix the market. But the state is really trying to create a new market. So it has a transformative view on the economy. And this role of the central states doesn't neglect or doesn't prevent private companies to join in. Actually, it's the opposite. You have a sort of crowd in of private agents. So think about private companies such as BYD, or more recently NIO or XPeng, Li Auto. These are private companies that didn't exist before. And because of the state support in creating this new market, new channels or spaces of capital accumulation have been created, and therefore allowing private companies to join the bandwagon and therefore join the market. So there's no opposition between the state and the market in this sense, or the state and private companies. There are 4 core ministries I'd like to highlight that are very important in the promotion of this agenda. First, of course, the NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission, which plays a role of coordination. Then you have the MITI, the MIT, so the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, the Ministry of Science and Technology most, and of course the Ministry of Finance. These are the 4 core ministries for the promotion of this industry. The initial push was made by the Minister of Science and Technology under the leadership of Wang Gan, who was the then ministry between 2007 and 2018. So the initial push really came by the end of the 2000s. So this very strong support for electric vehicles. But as the industry developed, the MITI gained more importance, especially after 2016. So now I would argue that the MITI is more important than most. And the NDRC plays more of a coordinating role and try to put some coherence in all those policies. So having said that, so I've been discussing the role of the central state. It's important to have a look on the main policies put forward. And here we focus only on the more recent period, starting 2009. That's when this program goes to the road. So that's when the commercialization stage starts. Because before that, of course, there are a lot of investments, but mostly into prototypes and basic R&D. So it's 2009 with a pilot program when really EVs, electric vehicles, start to take the road. So we have a combination of supply and demand policies. So basically, the idea is to incentivize traditional ICE, so internal combustion engines companies, to transition to electric vehicles, or NEVs as they call in China, and also to promote new NEVs companies. I mentioned a couple of them, like XPeng and Li Auto, for instance. So we really have this combination, this policy package, in the sense that it's not one particular policy that makes a difference, but the combination of a coherent set of policies. And that's what I'd like to highlight. So there's no secret in terms of one particular policy. It's more about this coherent view, in a long-term view, which is manifested into different policies. So in terms of demand management, there are a whole series of policies that aims to change the relative prices of the economy in favor of NEVs. That is the idea that makes boost the demand for electric vehicles. And I like to highlight, for instance, government procurement, which is very important, especially at the beginning of the push, and especially for electric buses, as I discussed in the first figure. That is, the government really started to buy electric buses. And here I'm talking about most at the local level. So I'll discuss a bit more the case of Shenzhen and Suzhou later. That's very important because it reduces the uncertainty, the technological uncertainty, and allows new R&D investments to materialize and guarantees a robust demand. So really reduce the uncertainty and gives private players a more stable view on the long-term process of development of this technology. This leads to a process of learning by doing. So companies started to produce. This creates the accumulation of productive capabilities. So companies started to learn how to produce, how to master this new technology, and as a result, have technological progress. So this technological progress is somehow induced by the demand created by state policies. Another important issue that sometimes it's overlooked is the importance of charging infrastructure. This is very important because, as you know, the driving range of electric vehicles, especially at the beginning, was not so long. That means drivers must recharge it very quickly. So the provision of widespread charging infrastructure was and still is very important in order to boost demand for NEVs. On a theoretical level, this is somehow similar or a readaptation of the old argument of the big push. That is, in order to promote one particular industry, you have to promote many at the same time and coordinate all these different investments, especially when the final demand for a certain good depends on a basic level of infrastructure investments. So after giving this overview, let's say, of the main policies, or if you wish, the rationale behind these policies, then I can move more specifically to some specific policies here. So I'd like to highlight again this idea of a policy package. That is, it's not one single policy that matters, but actually a combination of coherent policies. And here we have a lot of incentives, both fiscal and financial incentives, but also regulatory policies or regulatory incentives that have becoming more important over time. So tax exemptions were very important, in particular the exemption for the sales tax, and that's still valid until 2023. But I like to highlight the purchase subsidies. So these are subsidies when you buy electric vehicle, and it started in 2013 and has ended last year, 2022. It was supposed to end in 2020, but due to the pandemic, it was extended for 2 more years, but now it's over. And when I will discuss the issue of state-business relations, I will delve more into this issue, that is, the subsidies or the value of the subsidies have been linked to the technological upgrading of those vehicles, in particular, the driving range. So if you take the driving range as a proxy for a degree of technological upgrading, what you have is that vehicles with a higher driving range, or in other words, vehicles with higher sophistication, using here driving range as a proxy, of course, they receive more subsidies. I will discuss it later. Now, as the importance of fiscal subsidies or fiscal support was decreasing over time, especially in the late 2010s, China started to implement different policies now, more regulatory policies, in order to somehow support the rise of the industry. So here we highlight the so-called dual credit policy. That is, it's a type of or adaptation of a sort of carbon market. Actually, they learned that from what California was doing before in the US. So it's the idea here you have 2 different credit policies. One is for traditional automotive companies that they must produce a more fuel-efficient ICE vehicles. So as they produce more fuel-efficient ICE vehicles, they gain more credits. But there's a second credit policy, that is, if you produce a minimum level of NEVs, you also gain more credits. So that's an idea to try to nudge different companies to transition from inefficient ICE vehicles to more fuel-efficient ICE vehicles, and in particular, NEVs, electric vehicles. And this has started in 2019. Then you have different types of regulatory policies. One that is very important, and perhaps one of the most relevant for us, is sometimes it's called the green license plate, or only the new license plate policy. That is, in many Chinese cities, not all of them, but especially the largest ones, vehicles must go through a lottery or an auction system in order to get the new plate. That's valid for everyone. So if you buy a new car, you have to go through this lottery or auction. And the problem is, this is a very time-consuming process, and especially very expensive. Sometimes to get a new plate, the cost is pretty much the same as the cost of the vehicle. So you end up paying twice, basically. And the innovation here, the regulatory policy here, was to exempt NEVs from this policy. And that, of course, has boosted demand quite tremendously in the cities where they have implemented that. And I also like to highlight other types of regulatory policies, such as special access to roads. So that is, some roads are not, ICE vehicles are not allowed to drive, but NEVs are. So we have preferential rules in terms of access to roads, also preferential rules in order to use public parking space. There are, of course, exemptions from tolls in many cities. So there's a whole array of different regulatory policies that in practice are incentivizing the adoption of electric vehicles in detriment of ICE vehicles. So it's the idea again of changing the relative price of the economy towards the direction of technological transformation that the government wishes. And I like to highlight the importance of, again, of government procurement, especially for the case of city buses, so for the public fleet. And that's when the Chinese government uses its monopoly power. In other words, the government is the only buyer here. So the structure of the demand is very concentrated. That means the government uses this monopoly power in order to create the demand. That is an overview of the main policies, or the more relevant policies in the period, although there are other smaller ones, and different cities have come up with different policies as well. But this is the essence of this policy packages, in my view. And then I move to the fourth part, that is state-business relations. Now, why is that important? So we have already seen that, first, the Chinese state, or in particular the central state, has been very active in promoting the industry, and in particular has been very active in disbursing subsidies, so supporting financially different companies. And then you have a theoretical debate, which is very dear to political economy. That is, what is the problem of the state involving or meddling in the economy? And roughly speaking, I have two different views here that I'd like to introduce. The first one is, I believe it's more heterodox, that comes from the developmental state debate, or if you wish, the idea of embedded autonomy by Peter Evans, for instance. So it's the idea that in order to promote economic development, what you need is somehow common project of capital accumulation. So common in the sense that the state and private companies or big conglomerations, they have to get together and create common projects of capital accumulation. So you need close relations between the state or the bureaucrats with private companies. Or if you wish, as Alexandre has said, another key scholar in the developmental state debate, the whole point about late industrialization is that you need a sort of reciprocal relationship between the state and private companies. So, and this has been justified based on, for instance, on the massive growth of South Korea in the post-war period, also Japan and Taiwan. These are the classical examples of developmental states. This view, of course, has been challenged by, I would say, more neoclassical economists. And here have the idea of rent-seeking, corruption, and of course, waste of resources. That is, as the state starts to meddle into the economy and as the state or state bureaucrats create ties or links with entrepreneurs and big business, you have a scope for corruption. So inefficient firms, you start to receive subsidies and you start to receive financial support when they're not deserving of that. You also have a problem of information. That is the idea that the state doesn't know in which industry we should invest, and the state doesn't know which company we should invest. That's a problem of information that leads to corruption and seeking. That is, private companies promote sort of state capture. So they capture the agenda for the state, and therefore they keep receiving subsidies when they should not be receiving. That ends or results in a waste of resources, and then the process will be a failure. So the answer for this line of argument by Amazon, among other scholars, is that the state should keep promoting industrial policies and disbursing subsidies, but they have to discipline private companies. What does she mean by discipline? So you give subsidies or give state support, but you need to impose a sort of performance standard from firms. So I give you subsidies, but you give me something back. That's basically the idea. And in the case of South Korea, of course, this was the idea of checking technological upgrading based on exports, which was the proxy created by the South Korean state. But the core idea that I'd like to highlight is it's important to give subsidies and important to give state support, but you need to have something back in exchange. And the state must monitor private companies and disburse subsidies based on a certain metric, on a certain proxy, normally related to productivity growth or technological upgrading. So this is the more theoretical debate. And then we move to the case of China, in particular for the case of electric vehicles. And here I'd like to highlight how this state-business relations in China has never been really ossified or has never been really stable. It has been always adapting. So there's a lot of institutional learning within this long-term agenda I was talking about. Although there are many different policies that China has been implementing, as discussed before in the third section of the presentation, my focus here is on purchase subsidies, this program that lasted between 2013 and 2022, as I mentioned it. And that's important because actually there were many cases of fraud and corruption which were uncovered. So this somehow seems to validate many of the neoclassical concerns. That is, if the state starts to disburse subsidies and support, you're going to end up with corruption, and that's a waste of resources. And I think what is important here to highlight is what was the reaction of the Chinese state and what does it tell us for the theory, which in my view tends to support much more the developmental state idea or the heterodox idea rather than the neoclassical view on corruption. That is, when they found out the corruption cases and the fraud, they did not end the program of subsidies. what they did is to promote new conditionalities, or if you wish, new discipline, to use the word or the expression by Amazon, mechanisms. That is, let's make the system, let's adapt, let's learn from this experience, and let's try to impose new technological requirements for companies. So you are still eligible for subsidies as long as you meet certain performance criteria, which is the core argument of Alice Amazon when she was studying the South Korea case. So here you see a replication of the argument, but of course under different circumstances. So it's not a copy, it's an adaptation. So for example, in 2016, only the driving range and maximum speed were parameters in order to receive subsidies. After all these cases of fraud and corruption, they added different technological criteria, for instance, minimal levels of energy efficiency and battery density. So these are different technological parameters that makes the state link technological upgrading to the disbursement of subsidies. So the idea here is really for lower products of lower sophistication to be gradually excluded from the. That was what happened. I show the next slide is I will show a table of the value of the subsidies, that to be more clear. So again, the idea is that the value of the subsidies should become more closely linked to the degree of technological sophistication or technological upgrading. And I hope this table helps to illustrate that. So here I gathered all the different subsidy standards from 2013 when it started until 2022 when it has been finished. So you have basically 10 years of subsidies. Again, here I'm talking about only purchase subsidies. And what you can see in the beginning is that the value was actually much higher between 2013 and 2016. After that, after 2016 and 2017, when the cases of fraud were unveiled, they started to reduce the value of the subsidies based on the technological upgrading parameters. So what I call here R on the first column is the driving range. So how far a car can go, a vehicle can go without recharging. So what you can see is first that they start to stagger the value of the subsidy. So by the end of the decade, only vehicles going more than 300 kilometers were allowed, were eligible for the subsidies. In other words, I'm trying to illustrate what I said before, that is, vehicles of lower technological sophistication are not allowed anymore to receive subsidies. So that's a strategy, again, to create a sort of exchange between the state and private companies. So I give you subsidies and you give me back something else. And something else in this case means higher technological upgrading, so higher sophistication. So that's an attempt to discipline private companies. So that's the general idea. And as you can see, the standard, the basic standard has been decreasing over time as the market was becoming more mature. So as the technology was becoming more mature. So now we can say that the electric vehicles market in China is already a reality. It exists. Well, it was not the case back 2013, 14, when the market was really starting from the scratch, and actually most of the companies were producing electric buses and not that much private passenger cars. So I think you can say that this strategy worked for this initial phase of creating the market. So now I move to almost the final part of the presentation, that is the role of local states. That is much of what I discussed here, both the main policies put forward by the state and also the state-business relations are actually permeated by the very important role of local states in China. So why to focus on local states? First, there is a historical importance of local governments for economic development in China, and there's a whole literature on different regional models in contemporary China. So some people have already put forward the idea of a local developmental state in China, that is, local governments, they behave in sort of developmental way, somehow mimicking what happened in East Asia before. There's also the idea of the local entrepreneurial state by Jenny Duckett, which is different from what currently Mazzucato calls. So the label is the same, entrepreneurial, but the idea is slightly different. But what I'm trying to highlight here is there's a long tradition in the scholarship in delving into the debate of the local state in China and how they are dynamos for promoting economic development. And there is a sort of dominant discourse in the West. I feel that there's been a process of centralization under Xi Jinping in the past 5 to 10 years. What I'd like to highlight here with this figure is that local state is still important even under Xi, especially when you see the figure for budgetary expenditures and also investment in fixed assets. So if you take, for instance, the orange line, that is the share of fiscal expenditures made by subnational governments, and that is over 80% of the total. And you can see it has been increasing on the 2000 onwards. It has never decreased. The same trend you can realize for investment in fixed assets. That's the yellow line, so the top line. So the subnational investments share of the total. And conversely, of course, you have the central share decreasing. Of course, they have to sum up 100%. So both the blue line and the gray line represent the central share of both fiscal expenditures and investments. That means local states are still very important. So at least on the fiscal aspect, there is no centralization here. The same trend goes for the allocation of S&T funds, S&T meaning science and technology. So again, the same trend. So the blue bar represents the share of the central state, and the orange bar represents the share of subnational states. So again, you can see the same trend, that is the share of subnational states increasing over time. So again, local states are still very important. More recently, there's this whole debate about industrial guidance funds that has been calling attention for many scholars. That is, the Chinese state is trying to emulate kind of venture capitals, but it's a kind of state-led venture capital idea. So that's the idea of industrial guidance funds that has become very important in the past 5 to 10 years. And what I see here is again the same. If you take the division of the funds based on different levels of government, we see that the central state corresponds to only 19, so 1/5, 20%, if you wish, of the total. And the rest is dominated by different levels of subnational governments, in particular city levels, so municipal governments. So again, local state is still very important. So that's always important to highlight that, because sometimes people have the impression that because the central state is very important in China, and of course it is, they have a sort of blueprint and local states will just replicate that. And that's not really the case. There's a lot of flexibility and adaptation, especially at the local level. So then that's really the final part. If we still have time, Lorenza, please let me know if I exceed the time. And so it's a comparison between Shenzhen and Suzhou. And this part is pretty much based on the paper we published. So despite this massive growth of the Chinese market, we highlight that there's a lot of important regional variation. That is, just to give a data, only 30 cities corresponded to around 70% of national electric vehicle sales. That is, there's a lot of heterogeneities as well. So the idea of the paper was try to explain how this mixed picture have emerged and to explain these divergent outcomes. Then you provide the comparison between two different cities, that is Shenzhen and Suzhou. And why? Because as I'm going to show, these two cities, Shenzhen and Suzhou, they are very similar in terms of socioeconomic indicators. So they have very similar structures. However, their outcome in terms of NEVs, so electric vehicles, deployment, have been very different. So Shenzhen has done pretty much 10 times more than Suzhou. So the idea was to explain why, despite the similarities in terms of their socioeconomic structures, why specifically for NEVs they have been performing in such a divergent manner. So the idea was to highlight this divergence, and then as you can have a nuanced picture of what's going on at the local level, hopefully this will, of course, also shed a light on the implementation strategies we found in China and what does it tell us about the national strategy of EVs. Then I go to work. Can you see my screen? I think it's going. Okay, so I was trying to make point the case that these two cities are very similar. So here this table tries to illustrate that. So if you see both in terms of GDP or GDP per capita, or even the local budgetary revenues of both cities, while you see that both cities are actually on the same league, so they are very similar. So they are on the same shelf, so to speak. So again, part of our methodology is to say, if these two cities they are very similar, so why they diverge so much in terms of NEVs? So we use the triangulation strategy, that is, we try to have a look on Chinese language policy documents from both cities. We also made use of news sources for electric vehicles, and of course we made interviews with actors in China. And we developed an analytical framework to study empirically the creation of the electric vehicles market at the local level, at the city level. So our analytical framework, that this figure you can find in the paper that has been published, is that we try to understand the creation of this NEV market demand based on three core variables. So that is the demand structure, which depends really on the different segments we're talking about, on the complementary sector, that in this case is the charging infrastructure, and of course on the coordination of these different policies. So it's not enough to have certain policies, but to coordinate them, especially when it comes to the complementary sector, the charging infrastructure. So here the idea was to, as I mentioned briefly, to break down NEVs into different segments. And why is that important? This is very important because those different segments have a very different demand structure. So here we're trying to again emphasize the importance of the demand structure for industrial policies and how the Chinese state has been taking advantage or harnessing these different demand structures. So if you start with public buses and go to logistics vehicles are those, again, minivans and delivery trucks, and then finally go to private passenger cars, you start with a kind of single buyer or a monopoly structure. That is, there's only one buyer in the economy. Typically, it's the local state, so the local transportation company. And then you move towards a more decentralized structure, that is the one more familiarized with everyone, that is for private passenger cars. So individual families or individuals buy cars, basically. And the idea here is that public buses, they render a more direct, they have more direct mechanisms of demand management. And as you move forward to logistics vehicles and private passenger cars, the state has less direct mechanisms. So you move from, let's say, government purchases or procurements, which is a very direct order, to more soft policy. So what we found in general was that, so that's a general conclusion, that as we move forward from public buses to logistics vehicles, and then especially to private passenger cars, these mechanisms available for demand management become less direct, so they become more indirect. And the establishment of the complementary sector, that is, in this case, the charging infrastructure, becomes more difficult. And as a result, in order to achieve this sort of policy alignment or this coordination, everything becomes more complex and more difficult, especially because you have an increasing number of state actors that need to be coordinated. That means that as a result, market creation for NEVs becomes more difficult. And indeed, when NEVs started to boom in the 2013, 14, 15, sales were pretty much concentrated in electric buses and then logistics vehicles. So private passenger cars started to increase only by later on, after. So here I try to summarize some of the policies in relation to the demand structure, again, discriminating by different segments. And again, the idea is that when you have public buses, you can use public procurement, which is by definition a very direct strategy or a very direct policy. But then as you move to logistics vehicles, you cannot use public procurement anymore because you do control the buyers. But you can still do some direct measures, such as the prohibition of new purchases, which was done in Shenzhen, for instance. But as you move to private passenger cars, you cannot prohibit new sales. I mean, in theory, you can, of course, and many countries have been setting deadlines for bans, right? Especially some European countries. But China has never done that. China has never banned the sales of ICE vehicles. So what they have been doing instead is to create a whole series of regulatory policies, such as special access and different sort of subsidies in order to promote private passenger cars. And what I found out here, again, that Shenzhen advanced much more in all of those segments because they have been more incisive in terms of their policies. But again, the core idea here is that the mechanisms for demand management become more indirect over time. When you go to the complementary sector, the idea is very similar. So when you have public buses, you can use SOEs, state-owned enterprises, to build a very limited number of charging stations and in very stable places. So you know what is the route of the buses, so you know where to build those charging stations. As you move to private passenger cars, things become more messy. So you need to rely on private and different charging points providers. And what the state has been doing is to provide subsidies and the so-called land use policy mandates. That is, there are mandates in terms of the percentage of, for instance, parking spaces, which will be used by electric vehicles in terms of charging infrastructure. So let's say you have to put 20%, have to install 20%, 20% of the parking lots will be equipped with charging infrastructure. So these are policy mandates. So here a brief comparison between Shenzhen and Suzhou. So what you can see here, first the results, so in yellow highlighted, Shenzhen has much more charging points than Suzhou, so almost 8 times more. But interestingly, if you see the subsidies, you can see that Suzhou has actually offered less. Suzhou has offered more subsidies. So Suzhou has spent more subsidies on charging infrastructure than Shenzhen, but the results have been the opposite. The explanation for that is pretty much based on the land use policy mandates, where Shenzhen has been much more aggressive in terms of mandating different percentages for infrastructure to be built. And that's, of course, dependent on a sort of coherence urban planning policy that takes place by definition on the local level. And that's where Shenzhen really excels many other cities, especially Suzhou. So the idea of incorporating the build of charging points or charging stations into a local level urban policy has been much stronger in Shenzhen than Suzhou. And the reason for that, as we found, is based on the different bureaucratic or administrative structures of these two cities, which is a topic that often is neglected by economists, but often political scientists try to emphasize that more. That's something we also discussed in the paper. That is, in Shenzhen, we have a much more, let's say, a linear structure. That is, they only have urban districts, which by definition are controlled by the city, by the prefecture. However, in Suzhou, we have a much more fragmented structure. For instance, you have 4 different county-level cities. In the past, it was 5, but in 2012, they incorporated 1 county-level city. And that is, these county-level cities, they have a greater autonomy in terms of policy implementation. So they can come up with different policies, depending on their interests. That means a fragmentation of the policy space in Suzhou, something that Shenzhen has never had this problem with. So really like to highlight here the importance of different urban policies and urban planning, and how this impacts or not the different policies for charging infrastructure. So there's no way to study the build of charging points or charging stations without into the broader debate of urban planning, because of this whole series of investments that are required, and of course the idea that you have to build a whole new infrastructure out of nothing. So one consequence of this more fragmented structure in Suzhou is that this has led to delays in local subsidies, because different county-level cities have different policies for local subsidies, and also different counties have promoted different technologies. For instance, Kunshan, which is the stronger and wealthiest county in Suzhou have promoted the use of LNG technology. It's a different technology, and therefore you fragment the demand for electric vehicles, you fragment the infrastructure, because the infrastructure for LNG buses is very different than the infrastructure for electric vehicles. So again, you fragment the market, and therefore you slow down the adoption of a new technology. And in Shenzhen, you have a more direct relationship with the central government, therefore they implemented those policies more swiftly. And finally, to conclude, that's my last slide. Some key points I'd like to highlight here, and hopefully can proceed with our discussions. So first point is the forceful modification of the relative price of the economy. So that's what Alexandre called it before, getting the price wrong. So you actively change the price of the economy, in this case in favor of NEVs. So the idea here is not really to fix a market, because the market doesn't exist in first place. You have to really create the market. And there's no way to create a market by following your comparative advantages. Otherwise, you're going to keep producing what have been producing before. So you really have to take an active role and modify the relative price of the economy in order to create a new market out of nothing. The second point is the division of tasks, so to speak, between the central and local state. So the central state really provides this long-term view, the strategy, the objectives, and tries to connect this particular strategy that is electric vehicles with a broader strategy that is innovation-driven development and indigenous innovation. Then you have the key role of local states, which are very important in terms of implementation and flexibility and experimentalism, coming up with different policies and innovating in terms of policy implementation. Third point is, again, to highlight the role of demand. So the key ability of the Chinese state to harness the demand for electric vehicles. But as I try to emphasize with my segmentation of the demand structure, these abilities really depends on which segments you're talking about. So it's much easier for electric buses because you can make use of a state-owned company that is the local transportation company, and use public procurement, but more difficult in the case of private passenger cars. Then fourth point, again, going back to the issue of state-business relations and the idea of discipline. Although China has been putting forward a lot of financial and fiscal incentives, they have also trying to discipline private companies, especially in relation to technological sophistication. This process has not been perfect. There are cases of waste of resources, if you wish, but overall, my assessment that the policy has worked in terms of creating the market and also helping companies to upgrade. And here, I think the key point is BYD, for instance, the Shenzhen-based company BYD. And finally, the key importance of the coordination of policies, especially in the establishment of a charging infrastructure and for policy implementation. Again, when it comes to creating a vast and widespread charging infrastructure, there is no way to study that without incorporating into the process of urban planning, urban projects. That requires a lot of coordination and the use of different local level bureaus in order to implement different policies. So I leave you there, and I think I exceeded my time probably. And thank you for the opportunity. I'm looking forward for your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Alexander. No worries at all. I didn't stop you on purpose because I was sure our audience was interested in your presentation. I now leave it to Tommaso for a quick discussion, then we open the floor. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra. I will be very quick also because there are other people in the room. I'm thinking, for example, of Mark, Marc Alochet has written a couple of papers on precisely the role of public regulations in developing NEV, and I'm sure he will have also a long series of comments and questions. So I will keep it short, and also I have to be honest. I'm going to react to your presentation, but I didn't have papers. I will read that afterwards. So it's based just on what you just said. So I will start first about the fact that you have highlighted very rightly that key dimension in the successful development of NEV is the relationship between states and private companies. Now, what is interesting here is that in the development of the Chinese automotive industry before, that was not really the case, in the sense that all the main Chinese companies that have come to dominate the Chinese markets by the early 2010s were joint venture between state-owned companies and Western car manufacturers. And I wanted to ask if there was some acknowledgement by the central government that while this policy have been successful in developing the markets and creating wealth for state-owned companies, it hasn't been very successful in developing the national champions that we're looking at. So the market was dominated basically by foreign technologies, by foreign companies with their products. It was an El Dorado for several European and American companies. But it was not really developing Chinese companies and technology. And with the NEV, we've seen a shifting in terms of strategy in which private-owned companies, not controlled by the state, have become the key actors, both in battery manufacturing that you didn't touch upon, but also in the manufacturing of new electric vehicles. So that was a conscious shift in strategy in terms of how do you approach the development of national champions from national state-owned companies to more private-owned actors. Take into account also that in other sectors like in internet or portable phones, the champions that have emerged in China are all private companies and not the initial attempt to create state-owned companies in this sector. So that would be my first question. The second question is really what is fascinating here is that because they are relying on companies that did not exist yet or were very small. I mean, all the like BID or Great Wall. I mean, they were not big companies at the time when this company started. That means that the bureaucratic actors were crucial at the beginning. So that's really the state-driven project. It's not like you have, I mean, it doesn't look like you have companies making lobbying saying, we are ready to invade the markets with new energy vehicles. Please make a policy for us. It was rather the state saying, well, I will create a new sector and I will be driving the game. And then I look how that goes and I will adjust my policies to raise private actors that are competitive and efficient. And so I adjust my policy and I am on the driving seat. It's really like, so I don't know what chances you had to look at that, but who are the actors that, I mean, you mentioned 4 entities in the government, how much stable they are, who are the bureaucrats, is it political driven? I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about this bureaucratic core that seems to be on the driving seats? It's really like a state-led creation, relying on private companies to fill in terms of technology and products, but it is really not like private companies lobbying for a market to be created, but it's the other way down, the other way around. I mean, that looks like this way. Now, I remember that when we started to look at NEV policies, like in 2014 or 2015, the neoclassical criticism that you mentioned was very present. And I remember that in Japisa, people say, well, yeah, but look, it's very fragmented. They're giving money to everybody. I mean, they do not select champions. They just give money to anybody who wants to produce NEVs. You have hundreds of manufacturers of NEVs. It is really not articulate. For the very reason you emphasize the importance of local government. Each local government wants to have its own industry. So that is a multiplication of subsidies. It's not efficient. There is no selection or coordination. And indeed, when you were looking where these NEV were developing, you would see that there were cities in particular where you had the lottery. So that people basically could not access normal cars, and the only way for them to access cars and avoid the lottery was to buy these NEVs. So it looked like a protected market, not very efficient, not driven really by consumer wanted to buy these cars, but rather by a specific environment where consumers could not buy other cars and were forced to buy NEVs that seemed at least initially not efficient. So I remember that in 2015, 2016, these neoclassical criticism was actually quite present, not necessarily from neoclassical research, but in this type of criticism that this is not an efficient policy, it's just spreading money around, creating many producers, but none of them will survive if that was a real competition. And then things change. So I mean, I don't know how do you look at the criticism, but really, I remember there was initial skepticism, and then the markets start to grow, and then you start to see producers that were efficient, and then you start to see producer outplaying big Western companies, capturing more and more market shares. And also, for example, if I'm not wrong, the Wuling small compact cars that has been the most sold electric cars in 2021, 2022 is actually as a small range, small battery, so it doesn't receive any subsidies. So it is competitive only on the ground of their market power. It's not anymore supported by any policy. There's been kind of shifting in perspective. Initially, I think general feeling that was not working, and there was a general feeling about electrification that was in the same way. And then quite rapidly things has turned around. So how do you how do you explain this change in perspective? Because it was wrong to criticize, or there's been a change in the way the policy has been set up. And that goes into your way of explaining this change in policies as a way of addressing frauds and addressing problems in terms of making discipline of companies. But I was wondering if there was another component, which is like an evolutionary policy in which, first of all, you create a market and you create incentives for anybody to step in. And then progressively, you raise the bar so that you select the best companies. It's not just because there were some companies that were making frauds. It's just that first you bring in the actors, you create competition, and then you change your regulation in order to drive technological innovations from the actors and keep this competition for incentives, not about looking for subsidies and corruption, but really about stepping up in terms of the requirements, so that the policies, that the early criticism, I provide a sort of answer to my question before, so that what was criticized, it was just the first step, and actually the policy was taking into account that the next step would address these issues, because you needed first a lot of actors and a lot of competition in order to second shape select out of competition and not out of bureaucratic choice, which actors will be more competitive by adding more and more technological requirements to the regulation. And that's ex post, it seems like a coherent strategy, but I don't know if that is the way it's shaped. I mean, it was an error, trial and error, and then they found the right way, or do you feel that from the beginning there was sort of plan and coherent long view in terms of how you address this issue? So when you look, so just like I conclude, so when you look at the difference between Shenzhen and Suzhou, I was wondering whether this early explication that I did some early, just the presentation, we didn't publish anything, but I was working with the Chinese PhD student that has done a PhD on the second-hand markets in China, which is also another interesting component of the success of the Chinese automotive industry, that the Chinese second-hand market is heavily regulated, so that the second market is not competing with the sales of new cars, or very little. So that, for example, if in the regions where you have most of the cars, you cannot take the second-hand cars from that region and sold in place where you don't have cars, because that would kill the market there, because people that have less money would buy just only second-hand cars. So the regulation prevents the fact that you have an even development between regions, that results in second-hand cars covering for the needs of the most lagging regions. And you prevent that so that everybody will in time step into buying new cars rather than using second-hand cars. Anyway, we were looking at these lots with the insurance data on the role of lottery, and we found out that really most of the market, really like 90% of the sales were really concentrated in cities where you add this lottery. And this also conferred to the local governments a lot of power, because they could select which cars, which models, which brands would actually be able to receive this exemption from the lottery, so that you will receive basically the plate, because you simply cannot register your car if you don't have a plate, and there is a lottery for that, so that the sales are reduced because of the congestion and of the pollution. But for electric cars, you skip that and you don't pay for that, and that is a huge boost. So is that a factor in your Shenzhen and Suzhou comparison? Because you mentioned subsidized, you mentioned the way it works, but I wasn't sure about this role of the lottery, which perhaps could give I would say an explanation of why the difference is so big. I'm not saying that the other factors you mentioned are not important, but it seems that lottery was really a discriminating factor, at least in the early phase. I stop here and just thank you again for this overview. And I'm looking forward to read your papers after the discussion, sorry, but that anyway, you really give us, I think, a very important reason to read your papers and your coming up book.
Thank you very much. So Alexander, you have, we will give Alexander the opportunity to respond to Tommaso's inputs, and then we open the floor. I see that Mark has already booked his spot, so Mark will follow. But first, Alexander, please, you have a chance to respond.
Okay. Thank you, Tommaso, for your comments and questions. I mean, they're all very, very relevant and provides a lot of food for thought. So thank you for that. I try to address them in order. Hopefully I don't take much long. So the first point about state-business relations and this comparison between the traditional ICE, the internal combustion, and the new EV industry. Yes, it was a conscious decision in the sense that there was a conscious disappointment with the results in the traditional IC industry in terms of technological upgrading, and the fact that they did not manage to actually export to major markets, and they did not manage to arrive at the global frontier in terms of technology. So something I didn't mention today, but also is very important, is the idea of leapfrogging development, of course. So really the idea of trying to take advantage of lower barriers to entry in an industry that didn't exist globally, or pretty much didn't exist back in 2009. So the idea was not simply to invest in a new industry at home, but it was a new industry globally. That means you don't have any strong incumbent leader. So I think the rationale was realize you cannot compete with the big legacy automakers because they are already too strong. There's a lot of very high barriers to entry, so the gap is too big. So let's try to take advantage of a lower technological gap. And the best way to do it is to promote the leapfrogging development strategy. That is, let's start creating a new industry out of nothing, so we become the incumbent leader. So the only exception here would be Tesla, in the sense that Tesla has an important position. So yes, so the decision to promote EVs came in great part as a result of assessment that is, they somehow were disappointed with the results in terms of technological upgrading the traditional ICE industry. So the idea here was not that much promote joint ventures, but to create the market and allow private companies or state-owned companies to ascend, basically. Which does not mean that they exclude private companies. Again, Tesla has established a factory in Shanghai in late 2019. Tesla has important market share in China, but the relationship has been put in very different grounds, because now Chinese companies have actual technological capabilities to compete with those private companies. So it was really the idea of creating a new market and setting the direction and giving the instruments or the financial possibilities for domestic companies to compete on an equal foot. So again, taking advantage of lower barriers to entry. The second point, your second to third point, I tend to agree. And second, what you have just said about the idea of that is really a state-driven project in which private companies fill in the spaces. So they rely on private firms, but let's say the agenda setter is a state. That's the key point. So who controls the agenda, in my opinion, is the key point. And then it's really difficult to really pin down and what's going on inside the ministries, unless you have, of course, insider access. But what I understand from reading not only policy documents, but talking to people in China is that, well, this is really started before in the 90s, still in a timid fashion, but it gains a quite strong push after the 2008 crisis, and especially with Wang Dan, who was the then minister of the Minister of Science and Technology. So it was really a key bureaucrat which mobilized his networks inside the Chinese bureaucracy to put forward this agenda. And I think it's important to highlight that this does not preclude lobbying. Of course, lobbying still exists, but the key point again is who controls the agenda. And I think, from my understanding, who controls the agenda in the past was the state and still is the state. So again, you have common projects between state bureaucrats and private companies, but who is controlling the agenda seems to me still the state. Again, that doesn't prevent lobbies, but I think the core point, who is setting the direction. But I tend to agree with your interpretation as you describe it. I think the third point about the importance of local governments and the new classical argument and how this has changed in China over the decade, right? So I have 2 or 3 points I'd like to make here. So first, there was an evolutionary process indeed in terms of adapting those policies. So I try to highlight the importance of adaptation and institutional learning. So what does that mean? So it's the opposite of the idea of traditional, let's say, planning, in which you start with a plan and a goal and implement, and then you see what happens. Yeah, the idea is you start with a broader strategy and some key milestones and objectives, and then you start to implement, relying on local governments. And you rely on local governments precisely because they're closer to the ground, so they can come up with different strategies. And then you filter and select what's happening. So that entails a constant process of feedback. So it's not a rigid planning, it's more like, as you said, an evolutionary process which requires adaptation from the Chinese bureaucracy. That's quite important for us, especially in the book you are trying to publish. That is, we understand that there is common view that the Chinese bureaucracy, or bureaucracies in general, are always rigid and stable, and they keep doing the same forever. And what you're trying to put here is that, at least in this case of China, and in particular EVs, actually the bureaucracy has been quite active and changing different policies. And the case of the subsidies and the frauds is a case in point. So they are somehow forced to change their policies, not because they thought before, not because they had a master plan back in 2009 and then they decided to implement. No, it's because they had a core idea, and then based on the information they were gathering from local governments and from private companies, they decided to change route in the middle of the process. So that requires a lot of flexibility. And in my view, this is much more based on trial and error, as you said, rather than a sort of master plan developed by a very smart planner. So what makes this planning smart is precisely because they allow flexibility and allow trial and error. So that would be a core point here. So a lot of flexibility. And then you go to the issue of the local states, and you mention, of course, the Wuling Hongguan, which is mini EV. So it's an affordable, low-cost vehicle, which, as I said, doesn't receive subsidies. And that, again, illustrates what I was trying to say. So, of course, the core idea of the state is to promote technological upgrading, but there's no need to prohibit, for instance, low-cost vehicles such as the Wuling Hongguan. It's the best-selling product in China at the moment. So there is a contradiction here, that is the best-selling model is actually not really sophisticated technologically. However, it allows for the market to expand. So it's a sort of local adaptation based on the current levels of income per capita in China. Because, of course, the Chinese per capita income right now is something like 20% of the US. So you cannot expect that you can spread the same pattern of consumption in the Chinese society or any other middle-income country. So if you want to do that, you have 2 options. One, probably you're gonna spread this pattern of consumption only on the top of the pyramid, so the very rich people who are buying Teslas at the moment, or you're gonna have to create cheap adaptations that allows the average consumer in China to buy this EV. And what China is doing is pretty much both. So they have the segmentation not in terms of different segments, as I mentioned, but also a segmentation in terms of the market. So have low-end market, that's the case of the Wuling Hongguan. You have the high-end market. That's where people are buying Teslas and increasingly Chinese brands such as Li Auto, Xpeng, etc. So they allow this flexibility also for the segmentation of the market in terms of costs and technology. So again, the idea of flexibility. The role of then local states, so I think that's the final part of the question. And yeah, there is a process, the problem of duplication of investments, right? That was the case in the past and still is the case. In my view, there are too many companies. I think there are over 100 companies producing NVs. I think there's too many. That promotes the fragmentation of the market. My understanding or my reading is that this was necessary and important in this initial phase of creating the market. So you really leave local states with autonomy to come up with their own policies and support their own companies in order to promote the creation of the market. However, as the market matures, it will be necessary, in my view, to promote rounds of rationalization. Again, coming back to the debate on the East Asian model or the East Asian developmental state, they had somehow similar problems. I mean, different manifestations, of course, but they have a similar problem, that is there are too many companies sometimes. So what the state have done in Taiwan and South Korea in many cases was to promote rounds of rationalization. So to force the merger, for instance. And I feel as the Chinese market matures, that you have to do something similar in terms of reducing the number of players, because probably there will be too many in the future. I think otherwise, the same problems we are aware of the Chinese political economy, which we already have identified in the traditional ICE market, probably will take place as well in the case of EVs. And that leads to the point of lottery and auctions. Yes, for sure, lottery and auctions are very important. And yes, local states use the catalog in order to create technical parameters that benefits only local companies. So local protectionism. And that's a key point explaining the difference between Shenzhen and Suzhou. That's a point we highlight in the paper. So Shenzhen has made use of this policy, Suzhou has not. That's pretty much, there are different reasons, but I think the most important is because, of course, Shenzhen has BYD and other companies. Suzhou, although they have very important companies in terms of suppliers and components manufacturers, they do not have a manufacturer. So, but the most recent research I got from last year is that local protectionism has decreased in China in the past few years. So it's still important, but it's decreasing. I think that's it. Try to cover everything. Hopefully I answered the questions. If not, you can talk about it later.
Thank you very much, Alexander. We have Mark now, but I also invite you to read the points that were raised in the chat. There are a couple of questions, but now we invite Mark to contribute. Please, Mark.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I have been only looking at policies at the national level. So getting your insight of what's happening at the local level is very important. And as you point out, 20% of funding in 2020 were from the national state, so 80% from local state. So it's very important to get insight and feedback what's happening at local state. First point is a comment. You say it started in 2009. In fact, it started a little bit earlier. And if you want to go a little bit deeper, you can go back to the 90s, where you have the first technological R&D plan to develop new technologies about electrification. And in fact, you have a very important policy, which is development policy of auto industry in 2004. And this is where you have the announcement of the development of the new industry of new energy vehicle. So if you want to, to dig a little bit further in regulation, you can use this information. After that, I have three questions, in fact. As you pointed out, regulation subsidies at the national levels are dependent upon very stringent criteria. What's happening at the local level? Is there any criteria at the local level to get subsidies or not? And if yes, do you have any information about which type of criteria and how stringent they are? The second question, you say that roughly 70% of sales of NEV is done in 30 cities or something like that. But on the other side, if you look at, for instance, USA, you have a lot of sales of EVs in California, obviously, on the eastern side of USA. In Europe, it's basically the same thing. You have a lot of sales in countries with high GDP. So I would say that we could have expected the same outcome in China. So having very high sales, for instance, in the eastern side of China, and lower sales in central China and western China wouldn't be surprising in terms of GDP and development of technologies and also location of the automotive industry, because the main centers for Chinese automotive, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Wuhan, and Shenzhen, all of them are in the eastern part, and a little bit central for Wuhan and Shenzhen, that's right. So why would you have expected, in fact, to have more widespread scaling up of EVs in China? I think it seems logical to have this scale up of EVs located in certain area of China. And the last question is in fact about Shenzhen. And basically, I agree with Tommaso when he said that there is a strong willingness of the Chinese state to develop this industry. In fact, we can say very roughly that till 2025, the idea was to catch up with the global players. And from 2015, the idea is basically to shape the future of the automotive industry. It relates on made in China, which I've first says from made in China to created in China. And the second point is from big to strong. And very basically, the idea of the Chinese government is to take the lead of the global automotive industry thanks to the development of electric vehicles. And it goes to my last question. Shenzhen is the home of BYD. And obviously, BYD has been selected to be a national champion, for sure, and also probably a global champion. So don't you think there is also a reason, apart from everything you explained about the different of policies, the ways they have been applied between the two cities you have been looking at, but don't you think there is also a very important reason to explain why so many EVs have been sold in Shenzhen, basically to support the development of BYD? So that's my three questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. I will also give a chance to Martin to raise his question, and then we go back to Alexander for a reply. Martin, are you there? Yeah.
Yeah, hi.
Thank you.
So first, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. And I have one question related to the role of the state that you mentioned, and especially the interaction between central and local level. So if I remember correctly, there's an argument in the China literature that for the bureaucrats who are on the local level, if they do, let's say, a good job, let's say they have good performance of the industry that is under their control or oversight, that they have the possibility to get promoted to work for the central government. And so two questions. One would be, is there any case in your study, so for example, someone from Shenzhen who was, let's say, in charge of the automotive sector or the EV sector in that area, who has been promoted to central government position in any form? And the other is related to maybe Mark's question, is, let's say, I would disagree that, for example, Shenzhen is like a classical center of Chinese automotive industry. So is it not like more similar to maybe Tesla, who is pretty far away from everything that the American automotive industry is? That Shenzhen is relatively far away from the, let's say, traditional, especially state-controlled centers of automotive industry, would be my question, or my two questions.
very much. I think, Alexander, you have many issues to discuss, so you have the floor back now, please.
Thank you, Louisa, and thank you, Mark and Martin, for the comments and reaction. Again, very fruitful, very interesting points. So let me start the first point by Mark. Yes, I fully agree that the program of EV started way before in the 90s, and that's something we write in the paper and the book. But here I try to really, because of time constraints as well, try to really emphasize 2009 as the start of the commercialization phase with the pilot program, 10 cities, 1,000 vehicles. So just as sort of starting point in the more recent phase. But you're totally right. Starting in the 90s with prototypes are the investments in basic science. We fully agree. There's no question about it. Yeah, but I think that's written in the paper as well. And the second question about criteria at the local level for subsidies. Yeah, so there is, again, you have general criteria, so set by the central state. So for instance, thinking about the purchase subsidies, we discussed it and I showed the table. So those criteria are determined by the central state, and that's only the central state that decides. But local governments had the chance to come up with different policies. For instance, they had the chance to add subsidies. For instance, the central state gives a certain level of subsidies, and then different local states could add 100% or 50% if they wish. The local states determine if they want to add more or less subsidies. So they have this autonomy. They have this flexibility to give more or less subsidies. Also, in terms of criteria, and that comes back to the final question by Tommaso, for instance, the catalog. Yes, local states, they have used these public procurement policies, for instance, many times trying to favor their local companies. How have they done that? By setting certain technological parameters that only local companies could meet. So you have to build a certain chassis or a certain vehicle that has this particular dimension, and the only company that does that is my company. Then you win the procurement process. So that's something they have been doing, and I think it's always decreasing, but it probably is still important. So yes, they have this autonomy to come up with different technological parameters in certain circumstances as well. So that's also a key point. And then the point about regional concentration, well, you argue that that's not that surprising. I tend to agree with you in general, and not only for the EV industry, but for other industries in general. Of course, we should expect that larger and richer cities will concentrate the industry and consumption. However, what I was trying to highlight is first, although this policy has been put forward by the central state, again, the local states are very important in China. And here I'm trying to make the point against what I understand as a dominant view outside China, that is, whatever Beijing decides, there's a blueprint and everyone implements swiftly. So I understand that you do not have this view, but many people believe that, well, if China is doing well in whatever EVs that has been decided by the central state, that means every single city is doing more or less well. And so I was trying to combat this myth, I would say. So that was the core rationale, was more to highlight the role of the local state in contemporary China, even under Xi Jinping. So that was her strategic reason, in my view. Although I understand for other people who are more knowledgeable, that maybe is not a novel point. Final, the fourth point about BYD and Shenzhen, I think here is a bit more complicated. I think so. Let's think this way. BYD started 2003. As you correctly pointed out, the EV policy in China started in the 90s, so way before BYD even existed. And then when the commercialization phase started, 2009, BYD was really not well-known company. Probably if you could come back to 2009, if you ask what are the main companies in the Chinese economy, very few would point to BYD. So here, what you have is really a case of co-evolution between policies and companies. So it's not that BYD existed before and then came the policy. So the policy came before, and I come back to Tommaso's question, it's a state-driven agenda. So first came the agenda made by bureaucrats based on a long-term strategy. And then they use the local states to develop this and implement this strategy. And in the process, you have the creation and strengthening of certain companies that actually took advantage of this process. So eventually, yes, BOD became, this large company as you know it. And of course, they lobby the local government, especially again, for let's say local parameters. So Shenzhen has 100% of its fleet, which is electrified, right? And these are all BYD e-buses. So, of course, they have a strong lobby there. That's out of the question. But I still like to emphasize this idea of co-evolution. So BYD came in the process of strengthening the market. It's not that it was there before. Speaks to the question, the last question by Martin, right? So, yes, Shenzhen was not a traditional automotive center like Beijing and Shanghai. I tend to agree with that as well, and that possibly allowed BYD and Shenzhen to take the lead in an industry that was actually not existent before. So that's another key point. So in this sense, not a surprise that traditional automotive centers such as Beijing, Shanghai, bike and cycle did not perform as well as BYD. And I think one of the reasons is similar to the traditional Western legacy automakers. They have been producing ICE vehicles for a long time. So it's hard to disinvest these traditional investments. And BYD didn't have this problem. And the same for other startups. So I tend to agree with Martin on this point. But that's perhaps an advantage of Shenzhen BYD, that they were not a traditional automotive center. And final question by Martin, yes, the idea of central-local relations, there is literature on career concerns and upward mobility. It possibly plays a role, but I didn't investigate if there was a case of promotion. Probably there was, but I cannot really say for sure. So I have to I can try to search and tell you later, but at the moment I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. I don't know if there's any other question. I see that some people started leaving. Alexandre, like we also had some requests about your paper. So if you want to copy the link here, but I know it can be downloaded, right? It's available.
Yeah, it's open access, so we can.
Okay, so we will add it to the presentation of the seminar, so anybody will replay the video and access also your paper.
Any other last question? You have a last chance now. If not,
I was just wondering about the battery dimensions, because you didn't touch upon that. It's really about the vehicles, but now you must have focused the recent debate about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, the European reaction to that, and the fact that it suddenly seems like the European Union has realized that launching electrification without being sure of having battery industry ready, it was perhaps a mistake, and they're trying to correct that, also because China has a leading position. They control most of not the raw materials directly, even if some of raw materials are in China, but indirectly via the refinery of that, most of that is done in China and exported. And then they have the couple of giants like BYD, but also of course CATL, that have become leaders in the market, in the technology. And so it seems like, as you said before, that electrification is not only about selling electric cars, but creating a whole system of industries. And it seems like that the Chinese government has really had the sort of master plan from the beginning, not only infrastructure, but electric vehicles makers, but also raw materials with policies related to the place where these raw materials are and geopolitical influences, and then the battery makers, and then the cathode makers. So it looks like really more we understand the success of this policy, the more we see how it was really set up from the beginning to address all these issues. while it seems like in Europe and United States, there's kind of discovering how to deal with these issues ex post. And this seems to not be, in terms of competitiveness, it seems like really the government dimensions, it seems to bring a lot of competitive advantage to China because they really got everything right. So did you plan, or have you done some work about these battery dimensions, or did you plan to integrate in your analysis? And what do you think about that? I mean, it adds to your argument, but just wanted to have your feedback on this.
Okay, hold on, Alexander, 1 minute. Martin also has a follow-up, and then we come back to you for the last comments.
Yeah, so Tommaso gave me the word I was looking for. So when I listened to your presentation, the question of the battery is interesting to me because I don't remember exactly when, but there was a time when the Chinese government basically made it impossible for the Japanese and Korean battery makers to sell their batteries in China. And that was very obviously strategic to support their local producers. But this is ended, if I'm correctly informed. So is it that they intentionally gave them a grace period for, I know, your BYDs and CATLs and others to develop, or was it maybe more like trial and error to do that?
Okay, Alexander?
Thank you again for the questions. I haven't looked at the detail in terms of the battery, but yeah, as Tommaso mentioned, what I have looked at in terms of the strategy of the government there to really somehow create the whole supply chain. So yeah, it's not that China actually controls the raw materials, as Tommaso said, but they secured contracts with mining companies outside China, and they have, of course, a strong chemistry industry in the country that is able to refine the raw materials. And that's part of, again, general long-term strategy that I think Western countries only more recently started to pay attention. And I didn't study closely the issue of the batteries, but one thing that I'd like to discuss in the future, and I'm really having a look, and I think it's not really discussed normally, is the issue of the recycling of the batteries, which people normally don't discuss. So you created this massive box that will last between, let's say, 5 to 8 years, and then what are you going to do with that? And for environmental concerns. And there's no one discussing that, but China has also a subsidy program specifically to support companies that are developing recycling capacities. But I believe this is still understudied, and that's a direction for the research in the future that I'd like to pursue. So the recycling companies, how do they recycle company? I know that Germany has also investments in this area, and so let's see who will be able to master this technology. I believe will be a kind of game changer somehow, especially as the price of lithium, for instance, rises with demand. And for Martin's question, I'm not entirely sure that I have to have a look on the specifics, but I haven't studied really the specifics of the battery policies. So keep you owing this question.
Okay, thank you very much. I would also Mark as a last point. Mark, or is that a previous hand?
No, it's a new.
Okay, please
It's
go.
just a follow-up about batteries. That's true that China has a very systemic approach, and it is developing a new industry almost from scratch. It's vehicles, it's batteries, it's e-motors, raw materials, refining, and so on. And in fact, they started their strategy about raw materials in the 60s, and it started with rare earths. And they have developed strategies to be sure to get the monopoly on this raw material, and they have applied it later on for the other raw materials. Of course, they don't have mining capacity in China, but China is the first importer for lithium, cobalt, and nickel, for instance. And now they have the total control of, almost the total control of refining. So it's really a systemic approach, building a complete industry. And that could be interesting. In fact, I agree with Tommaso, if you can widen your scope on probably see how if local government have been also involved in developing this industry, I mean batteries, e-motors, and so on, or if they have only been focused on vehicles. That could be an additional question which could be interesting.
Okay, maybe for another book, Alexander. No, so I would also like to conclude by sharing that Alexander, we invited him, and he's also contributing, I mean, sharing his research as a chapter in the book on emerging auto industries that Martin and I are editing. So we will discuss his research also in comparative perspective, and I'm sure you will, as GRPSA members, you will hear from him again. So this is all from my side. At the moment, I don't know if there's any pressing comment, but I thank you all very much for joining and for all the insightful comments that you shared, for all the questions and the participation. It was a really, really interesting and rich debate. We have a last seminar in May, and then the colloquium, the GRPSA International Colloquium in June. I hope we will all meet again. And yeah, enjoy your weekend. Thank you very much. Thanks, Alexander, for sharing your super interesting research.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for the
Bye-bye.
invitation.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you.